They say pride comes before the fall, but for Mark Sterling, the fall didn't just hurt, it destroyed him. He stood in the middle of a crowded penthouse party, holding a glass of vintage Dom Perignon, laughing about how he had just tricked his simple wife into a penniless divorce settlement. He thought he had won. He thought she was just a nobody from nowhere. But he forgot the one rule of power: never underestimate the quiet ones. Mark didn't know that the woman he just discarded wasn't Sarah the waitress. She was the only daughter of the most dangerous man on Wall Street. And by the time the truth came out, it was already too late to run. The bass of the music at the Omni Club was so deep, it rattled the ice in the crystal glasses. It was a Friday night in Manhattan, the kind of night where the city lights looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. But inside the VIP penthouse suite, the only thing shining was Mark Sterling's ego. Mark, the 34-year-old CEO of Sterling Dynamics, stood on top of a velvet sofa, his tie loosened, his face flushed with the intoxication of absolute victory. He raised a bottle of champagne that cost more than most people's cars. "To freedom!" Mark bellowed his voice, cutting through the thumping house music. A roar of approval went up from the crowd. These were his people, tech bros, hedge fund managers, and social climbers. Clinging to his arm was Jessica Vane, a model-turned-influencer who had been the other woman for 6 months, and was now, as of 3 hours ago, officially the main attraction. "Tell them, Mark," Jessica giggled, leaning into him, her sharp nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Tell them what she got." Mark hopped down from the sofa, feigning a sad face. He gathered his inner circle, his lawyer Alan Harper and his CFO David Ross. Okay, settle down." Mark grinned, wiping champagne from his lip. "So we're in the mediation room, right? And Sarah is sitting there. You know Sarah. Quiet, mousy hair, wearing that same beige cardigan she's had since 2018. The group laughed. They all knew Sarah. Or they thought they did. For 5 years, she had been the dutiful invisible wife. She cooked, she cleaned, she stayed home while Mark built his empire. She never complained when he worked late. She never asked questions when he came home smelling like perfume that wasn't hers. "So Alan here." Mark pointed to his lawyer, a shark in a pinstripe suit, slides the papers across the table. The prenuptial amendment. Basically, it says she gets the Honda Civic, her personal clothes, and a lump sum of $10,000. 10 grand. David Ross choked on his drink. "Mark, your watch is worth 50. You're worth 80 million. "I know," Mark roared with laughter. "But here's the kicker. She didn't even read it. She just looked at me with those big, watery doe eyes and whispered, 'Is this what you really want, Mark?' And I said, 'Sarah, we just grew apart. I need space to grow.'" Space to grow his bank account. Alan, the lawyer, interjected, high-fiving Mark. "She signed it. No contest. No alimony. She waived her right to spousal support because she wanted to keep things amicable." Amicable, can you believe it? I've seen parking tickets fought harder than this divorce. Jessica kissed Mark on the cheek. She was just too stupid to know what she was entitled to, baby. She was holding you back. You need someone who matches your shine. Mark looked around the room feeling like a god. "She's packing her boxes right now. By tomorrow morning, Sterling Dynamics is solely mine. No marital assets to split. No 50-50. I kept the house, the cars, the stocks, and the future. I played the game, and I won." The party raged on. Mark felt untouchable. He had spent the last 5 years hiding assets in shell companies just in case, but he hadn't even needed to use them. Sarah had been so desperate to please him, so desperate to be the good wife, even in the end, that she had walked away with nothing but scraps. Around 2:00 a.m., the crowd began to thin out. Mark was sitting in a booth, nursing a whiskey, his arm around Jessica. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it. A text message. Sender, Sarah message. The keys are on the counter. I left the ring. Goodbye, Mark. Mark snorted and tossed the phone to Jessica. Look at that. Pathetic. Jessica read it and smirked. Good riddance. Did she take that stray cat she was always feeding? Probably, Mark said, closing his eyes and leaning back. God, I feel light. You know I was worried. I thought her dad might be an issue. Alan, the lawyer, looked up from his phone. Her dad, the mechanic from Ohio. Yeah. Mark waved a hand dismissively. She told me he was some retired blue-collar guy. Never met him. He didn't come to the wedding. Said he didn't travel well. I was worried he might tell her to get a lawyer. You know, working class people get greedy when they smell money. Well, he didn't, Alan said. And the ink is dry. It's done. You're a free man, Mark. Mark raised his glass one last time to the empty room. To the mechanic from Ohio. Thanks for raising a daughter with zero self-esteem. They laughed until their sides hurt. But miles away across the city, inside a private airfield that didn't appear on standard GPS maps, a black Gulfstream GX-50 jet was idling on the runway. The tail number was blocked from public tracking. A woman walked up the stairs of the jet. She wasn't wearing a beige cardigan. She was wearing a structured black trench coat that cost more than Mark's entire divorce settlement offer. She wore dark sunglasses, even though it was night. A man in a dark suit waited at the top of the stairs. He bowed his head low. Welcome home, Miss Blackwood. Sarah removed her sunglasses. Her eyes weren't watery or doe-like anymore. They were cold, hard steel. Is my father awake, Jenkins? He is waiting for you in the study, Miss Sarah. He has been watching the feeds. Sarah stepped into the luxury cabin. She pulled a diamond ring out of her pocket. The engagement ring Mark had bought her, a modest, slightly cloudy diamond, he claimed was vintage, but was actually just cheap. She dropped it into a glass of champagne the stewardess held out, watching it sink to the bottom. Tell the pilot to take off, Sarah said, her voice devoid of the softness Mark had mocked for 5 years. The experiment is over. It's time to initiate the acquisition. Back at the club, Mark Sterling dropped his whiskey glass. It shattered on the floor. A sudden, inexplicable chill had just run down his spine, cold enough to sober him up in a second. What's wrong? Jessica asked. I don't know, Mark muttered, rubbing his neck. Just a weird feeling, like someone walked over my grave. The hangover was brutal, but Mark Sterling was used to powering through them. He was a CEO after all. He showered, chugged an espresso, and dressed in his best Italian suit. Today was the first day of the rest of his life. Today he was going to announce the new merger with Orion Tech, a deal that would push his net worth into the 9-figure range. He stepped out of his penthouse, which was now legally 100% his, and whistled as he walked to his private elevator. When he reached the lobby, the concierge, a man named Gary, who usually greeted him with a smile and a salute, was staring at a computer screen with a furrowed brow. Morning, Gary, Mark called out, spinning his car keys. Beautiful day for a single man. Gary looked up, his face pale. Mr. Sterling, good morning. There are some gentlemen waiting for you by your car. Gentlemen reporters. Mark fixed his tie. I told the PR team to hold the press release until noon, but I guess the news of my freedom travels fast. I don't think they're reporters, sir, Gary said quietly. Mark frowned and pushed through the revolving doors. Parked directly behind his red Ferrari was a matte black SUV with tinted windows. 2 men stood beside it. They were massive, built like linebackers, wearing suits that strained against their muscles. They weren't wearing security badges, and they definitely weren't journalists. Mark slowed his pace, his arrogance faltering slightly. "Can I help you?" The passenger door of the SUV opened. A third man stepped out. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair slicked back and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He held a manila envelope. "Mark Sterling?" the man asked. His voice was like gravel grinding in a mixer. "Who's asking?" Mark demanded, trying to regain his posture. "If this is a process server, you're late. The divorce is finalized." The silver-haired man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Victor Thorne. I represent the Blackwood Trust." Mark blinked. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Blackwood? I don't know any Blackwoods. You have the wrong guy. Now move your truck, you're blocking my Ferrari." Victor Thorne didn't move. He tapped the envelope against his hand. "You finalized a divorce yesterday with a Sarah Miller. Is that correct?" "Sarah Miller." "Yes. My ex-wife." "What does she have to do with a trust?" Mark laughed incredulously. "Did she send you to beg for more money? Tell her the deal is signed. She gets the 10 grand and the Honda. No takebacks." Thorne stepped closer. He was shorter than Mark, but his presence was suffocating. "Sarah Miller is an alias, a pseudonym used for university and personal exploration. Her legal name is Sarah Blackwood." Mark stared at him. "Blackwood like Elias Blackwood." The air left Mark's lungs. Everyone in the business world knew the name Elias Blackwood. He was a ghost story, a titan of industry who owned shipping lines, steel mills, and half the real estate in New York, but who hadn't been seen in public since the late 90s. He was rumored to have connections that went far beyond the boardroom, deep into the gray areas of international politics and organized crime. "Elias is her father," Thorne said simply. Mark stood frozen on the sidewalk. The sounds of New York traffic faded into a dull buzz. That's impossible. Her dad is a mechanic in Ohio. I saw photos. He wears coveralls." "Mr. Blackwood enjoys restoring vintage motorcycles in his spare time," Thorne said dryly. "He values privacy. He wanted to see if you loved his daughter for who she was or for what she could give you." Thorne paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. "It appears," Thorne continued, "that you failed that assessment. Spectacularly." Mark felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Okay, look. So she's rich. Good for her. That doesn't change anything. We have a signed legal agreement. She waived her rights to my assets. I waived my rights to hers. It's ironclad. If she's a Blackwood great, she doesn't need my money anyway. So why are you here?" Thorne handed Mark the envelope. "We aren't here for your money, Mr. Sterling. We have plenty of money." Mark took the envelope. His hands were shaking slightly. "Then what is this? An eviction notice," Thorne said. "Eviction?" Mark laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. "I own the penthouse. I own the building. My company owns the mortgage." "Correction," Thorne said. "Your company Sterling Dynamics held the mortgage. However, Sterling Dynamics operates on a line of credit secured by the Vanguard Group. As of 8:00 a.m. this morning, the Vanguard Group sold that debt." Mark ripped open the envelope. Inside was a single document, a notice of immediate foreclosure and seizure of assets. "Who bought the debt?" Mark whispered. "Blackwood Holdings," Thorne answered. "We called in the loan, immediately. Since you leveraged your personal assets, this penthouse, your car, your portfolio to secure the company loan, we are seizing collateral effective immediately." "You can't do that," Mark screamed, stepping forward. One of the bodyguards twitched and Mark flinched back. "I have rights, I have 30 days. Read the fine print of your loan agreement, Mark, Thorne said coldly. There is a conduct clause. Any CEO involved in public scandal or reputational damage allows the lender to accelerate repayment. We have video of you last night, at the club, bragging about defrauding your wife, mocking the Blackwood family. It's going viral as we speak. Mark fumbled for his phone. He opened Twitter. Trending, one CEO exposed, young Sterling scum. There was a video, Jessica filming him on her phone, live streaming while he stood on the table, screaming about how he tricked Sarah. To the mechanic from Ohio. Thanks for raising a daughter with zero self-esteem. The video had 4 million views. This is, Mark stammered, this is a misunderstanding. Give me the keys to the Ferrari, Thorne said, holding out his hand. No. Mark clutched them tight. This is my car. It's the bank's car, and we are the bank. Thorne snapped his fingers. The 2 massive bodyguards stepped forward. They didn't hit him. They simply loomed over him, radiating violence. Mark, realizing he was about to be physically dismantled on the street in front of his doorman, dropped the keys into Thorne's hand. You won't get away with this, Mark hissed. I'm going to my office. I'm going to fix this. I have the merger today. Thorne smiled again. Ah, yes, the merger. Drive safely, Mr. Sterling. Oh, wait, you'll have to take an Uber. Thorne turned and got back into the SUV. The bodyguards followed. As the black truck pulled away, Mark was left standing on the curb, humiliated, stripped of his pride, and realizing that the mousy wife he had discarded was actually the shark that was about to eat him alive. Mark pulled out his phone to call his lawyer, Alan. It went straight to voicemail. You have reached the law offices of Alan Harper. I am currently unavailable. Mark cursed and hailed a yellow cab. He had to get to the office. As long as he was CEO, he could fight this. He could explain it to the board. He was the visionary. They needed him. But as the cab wove through traffic toward the glass tower of Sterling Dynamics, Mark didn't know that inside the boardroom, a woman in a black trench coat was already sitting at the head of the table. And she wasn't asking for permission to speak. Mark Sterling stormed into the lobby of Sterling Dynamics like a hurricane, though a slightly disheveled one. The yellow cab ride had been a nightmare of traffic, and smells a far cry from the air-conditioned leather of his Ferrari. He smoothed his suit jacket, checking his reflection in the glass doors. He looked frantic, but he told himself he looked energized, passionate. He walked toward the security turnstiles, ready to breeze through, as he had every morning for 10 years. Beep, beep, beep. A red light flashed. Access denied. Mark frowned and swiped his card again. Beep, beep, beep. Hey, Frank, Mark shouted at the security guard manning the desk. Machine's broken. Buzz me in. Frank, a man Mark had never bothered to learn the last name of, didn't jump up to help. He stayed seated, slowly chewing gum. He looked down at a clipboard, then back up at Mark. I can't do that, Mr. Sterling. Your clearance has been flagged. Flagged? Mark's voice rose an octave. I am the CIO. I own this building. If you don't open this gate in 3 seconds, you're fired. I don't think I am, Frank said, his voice surprisingly steady. But Mr. Thorne said if you arrived, we should escort you to the boardroom, manually. Frank pressed a button, and the gate clicked open. 2 more guardsmen Mark didn't recognize stepped out from the shadows. They flanked him. Right this way, sir, one said, gripping Mark's elbow. Get your hands off me. Mark yanked his arm away. I know the way to my own boardroom. He marched to the elevator, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. Thorne. That name again. How had they gotten into the building? How had they compromised security? It didn't matter. Once he got into that room with the Orion Tech investors, he would charm them. He would explain that this was a hostile takeover attempt by a disgruntled ex-wife. Investors hated drama. They would side with him. The elevator doors pinged open on the 40th floor. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. Usually his assistants would be buzzing around, bringing him coffee, briefing him on schedules. Today the desks were empty. Mark pushed open the double oak doors of the boardroom. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. I had a small—" The words died in his throat. The long mahogany table was full. The representatives from Orion Tech were there looking solemn. His own board of directors, men and women he had hand-picked for their loyalty, were there looking down at their laps. And at the head of the table, his seat sat Sarah. She wasn't wearing the black trench coat anymore. She was wearing a sharp, tailored white suit that made her glow against the dark wood of the room. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. She looked nothing like the woman who used to bake cookies and wait up for him. She looked like a queen on a throne. Behind her stood Victor Thorne, looking like her executioner. "You're in my seat," Mark snarled, his confusion instantly turning to aggression. "Sarah, get out. This is a business meeting. Go wait in the car." Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She slowly turned a page in the thick dossier in front of her. "Actually, Mark," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative, "we were just discussing the Q3 projections. You overestimated the Asian market growth by 14%. Amateur mistake." Mark's jaw dropped. "You don't know anything about the Asian market. You're a housewife." "I have a master's in international economics from Zurich," Sarah said, calmly looking up at him. "I didn't mention it because you told me on our first date that you didn't like women who think they're smarter than men. It seemed easier to let you believe what you wanted." A ripple of uncomfortable coughing went around the room. "Security!" Mark yelled, turning to the door. "Remove this woman. She is trespassing." "Sit down, Mark," said Mr. Henderson, the oldest member of the board. Mark spun around. "Henderson, you're letting this happen. She's nobody." "She is the majority shareholder," Henderson said, taking off his glasses. "As of this morning, Blackwood Holdings acquired 51% of the voting stock. They bought out the hedge funds. They own the company, Mark." "And," Sarah added, intertwining her fingers, "Orion Tech isn't merging with Sterling Dynamics. They are merging with Blackwood Holdings. We're absorbing your infrastructure, but we're cutting the dead weight." Mark felt the room spinning. "Dead weight? You," Sarah said. She slid a single piece of paper down the long table. It stopped perfectly in front of Mark. "Termination for cause," Sarah recited. "Gross negligence, misappropriation of company funds for personal lifestyle, reputational damage, and of course, incompetence." "Incompetence?" Mark laughed hysterically. "I built this company." "You built a house of cards," Sarah corrected. "I've been going over the books for the last 6 hours. You've been bleeding capital to pay for that penthouse, the parties, the gifts for your mistress. It's all there, Mark. Embezzlement is a felony." Mark slammed his hands on the table. "You can't prove that it was business entertainment." "We can prove it," Victor Thorne spoke up from the shadows. "Because we have your CFO David Ross in the other room. He's cutting a deal to avoid prison. He's telling us everything." Mark looked at the door. David, his friend, his wingman. "David sold me out." "Everyone has a price," Sarah said coldly. "You taught me that, Mark. Remember, everyone is an asset or a liability. Well, you just became a liability." She stood up. The room went silent. She walked around the table until she was standing inches from him. She smelled like expensive jasmine and cold rain. "You wanted a divorce, Mark. You wanted to be free of the simple wife who held you back. Congratulations. You are free. You're free of this company. You're free of your salary. You're free of your reputation." Mark stared at her hatred burning in his eyes. You think you've won? You think your daddy's money makes you safe? I'll sue you. I'll drag this out in court for years. With what money? Sarah asked softly. You have nothing. Your accounts are frozen, pending the investigation into the embezzlement. Your credit cards are cancelled, even your phone. She nodded at the device in his hand. It's company property. Mark's phone buzzed. A remote wipe command initiated. The screen went black. Get out of my building, Sarah whispered. This isn't over. Mark spat, backing away. I'll find a way. I always win. Security, Sarah said, turning her back on him. Escort Mr. Sterling to the exit. Do not let him retrieve any personal items. As the guards grabbed his arms, dragging him backward out of the room he had built, Mark saw Sarah take his seat at the head of the table. She didn't look back. She simply turned to the investors and said, Now let's discuss the restructuring. The doors slammed shut. Mark was thrown out onto the pavement. Literally. The guards shoved him through the revolving doors with enough force that he stumbled and fell onto his hands and knees. Passers-by stopped to look. Some took photos. A man in a tailored suit, the Wolf of Wall Street, wannabe, was now kneeling on the dirty sidewalk of Fifth Avenue. Mark scrambled up, brushing grit off his palms. He felt naked without his phone, without his car, without his power. I need to think, he muttered. He checked his pockets. He had his wallet, but Sarah said the cards were dead. He found a crumpled $20 bill and a pack of gum. That was his net worth. He walked to a payphone, one of the few left in the city, and dialed the only number he knew by heart. Jessica. Pick up, he hissed. Hello. Jessica's voice sounded bored. Jess, it's me. It's a disaster. She ambushed me. It's a hostile takeover. They froze everything. I know, Mark, Jessica said. It's all over the internet. Wow's broke billionaire is trending. Listen, baby, it's temporary. I just need a place to crash. I need you to wire me some cash so I can hire a shark lawyer. We'll sue them for everything. I'm coming over to your place. There was a pause, then a sigh. Mark, you can't come here. Why I bought that condo for you? Technically, Jessica said, her voice turning icy. Sterling Dynamics bought this condo as a corporate retreat. The lawyers called me 10 minutes ago. They're allowing me to stay if I cooperate with the investigation against you. I have to look out for myself, babe. You traitor, Mark screamed into the receiver. I made you. You're a loser, Mark, and I don't date losers. Don't call this number again. Click. Mark slammed the receiver against the metal box until the plastic cracked. He stood there panting as rain began to fall. The universe was really piling it on. He had nowhere to go, no friends, no money, no home. Then a sleek silver Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the curb. It moved silently like a shark in water. The back window rolled down. Victor Thorne sat inside. Get in, Mark, Thorne said. Go to hell, Mark spat. You've done enough. Mr. Blackwood wants to see you. Mark froze. The mechanic, the man in the coveralls, the man he had toasted to last night as a joke. A sudden hot rage filled Mark. This was the man responsible. Sarah was just a puppet. This old man was the one pulling the strings. If Mark could just talk to him, man to man, maybe he could work something out. Or maybe he could threaten him. Old men were easily intimidated. Fine, Mark said, pulling open the door. Take me to him. I have a few things to say to the mechanic. The interior of the Rolls-Royce was warmer than any room Mark had ever been in. He sat in sullen silence as the car navigated the city streets, heading toward the meatpacking district. They didn't go to an office tower. They pulled up to an enormous converted industrial warehouse made of red brick and reinforced steel. There were no signs, just a massive steel gate that rolled open as the car approached. The car drove inside the building. When Mark stepped out, he wasn't in a garage. He was in a private museum. The space was cavernous, lit by dramatic spotlights. And it was filled with cars. Not just any cars, Bugattis from the 1930s, Ferraris that had won Le Mans, Aston Martins that were one of a kind. It was a collection worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In the center of the room under a spotlight, an older man was working on the engine of a vintage Triumph motorcycle. He was wearing grease-stained coveralls, just like in the photos Sarah had shown Mark. "That's him," Mark whispered to Thorne. "That is Elias Blackwood," Thorne confirmed. Mark marched over his footsteps, echoing on the polished concrete floor. "Hey!" Mark shouted. "Blackwood!" The older man didn't jump. He slowly wiped a wrench with a rag, turning to face Mark. He had a face carved from granite, with eyes that were terrifyingly intelligent. He looked nothing like a simple mechanic now. He looked like a predator who had been resting. "Mark Sterling," Elias said. His voice was deep, resonating in his chest. "You're loud. Sarah always said you were loud." "Cut the act," Mark snapped, pointing a finger at him. "You think you can ruin my life just because I divorced your daughter. It's petty. I'm a businessman. I made a business decision." Elias chuckled. He walked over to a metal basin and began washing the grease from his hands. "A business decision," Elias repeated. "You see, Mark, that's where you made your mistake. You thought marriage was a transaction. You thought Sarah was an acquisition." "She lied to me," Mark yelled. "She pretended to be poor. That's fraud." Elias dried his hands on a pristine white towel. He tossed it aside and stepped closer to Mark. He was taller than he looked, and despite his age, he radiated a terrifying physical strength. "She didn't pretend to be poor, son. She pretended to be normal." Elias walked over to a small table and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He didn't offer one to Mark. He drank one himself. "Sarah wanted to know if she could be loved for herself," Elias continued. "Not for the Blackwood name, not for the billions, just Sarah. So we made a deal. She would live simply. She would work a normal job. If she found a man who loved her with nothing, she would give him everything." Elias turned his cold eyes on Mark. "She gave you 5 years, Mark. 5 years to show a shred of decency, to show that you valued her heart more than your image." "I gave her a life," Mark argued, though his voice was shaking now. "I let her live in my penthouse. You treated her like a servant." Elias roared, the sound echoing off the steel beams. Mark flinched back. "I watched," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I have security details on her 24/7. I saw you belittle her in front of your friends. I saw you cheat on her. I saw you make her feel small so you could feel big. I stayed my hand because she asked me to. She kept saying, 'He's just stressed, Dad. He's building his company.'" Elias took a step forward, and Mark took a step back, bumping into the fender of a 1964 Aston Martin. "But last night," Elias said, "when you celebrated destroying her, when you laughed about leaving her with nothing, that was the end of my patience." "So what?" Mark tried to sneer, but he looked terrified. "You took my company. Big deal. I'll start another one. I'm a genius." Elias smiled. It was a cruel smile. "You don't get it, do you? I didn't just take your company. I took your safety net." Elias snapped his fingers. Thorne stepped forward with a file. "You see," Elias said, "I know about the money laundering, Mark. The dealings with the cartels in Mexico to prop up your cash flow last year." Mark's blood ran cold. That's a lie. We have the wire transfers," Thorne said. "We have the emails. We have the encrypted chats." "I was desperate," Mark cried. "The market crashed. I needed liquidity." "And now," Elias said, checking his vintage Rolex, "the FBI has them too. I sent the package over about 20 minutes ago." Sirens began to wail in the distance. They were getting closer. Mark looked at the heavy steel doors of the warehouse. He looked at Elias Blackwood, the man he thought was a harmless mechanic. "You called the feds?" Mark whispered. "You're sending me to prison." "No," Elias said, turning back to his motorcycle. "You sent yourself to prison, Mark. I just turned on the lights." The sirens were right outside now. Blue and red lights flashed through the high windows. "Run," Elias said calmly. "It won't help, but it might be entertaining to watch." The sound of the sirens was deafening, bouncing off the steel walls of the warehouse like a physical blow. Mark Sterling, once the king of New York nightlife, stood frozen near the bumper of a vintage Jaguar. His heart hammered against his ribs, so hard he thought it might crack the bone. "This is a mistake," Mark screamed, turning back to Elias Blackwood. "Call them off. You have the power. You can stop this." Elias didn't even look up. He had returned his attention to the motorcycle engine, carefully tightening a bolt with the precision of a surgeon. To him, Mark was already gone. He was yesterday's trash waiting to be taken out. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse screeched open. FBI agents in tactical gear swarmed the space, their weapons-drawn voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of commands. "Federal agents, hands in the air." "Nobody move." Mark instinctively threw his hands up his knees, shaking. "It's him!" Mark shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. "He's the one. He kidnapped me. He's holding me against my will." The lead agent, a stern woman with eyes like flint, marched right past Mark. She stopped in front of Elias. She didn't raise her gun. Instead, she nodded respectfully. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "secure the scene." "Agent Miller," Elias replied calmly, wiping his hands on a rag. "The package is right there. He's all yours." Mark gasped. They knew each other. Of course they knew each other. The Blackwood influence didn't just stop at banks. It reached into the very machinery of justice. "Mark Sterling," Agent Miller said, turning on him. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit racketeering." "Racketeering?" Mark choked out. "I run a tech company." "We know about the cartel loans, Mark," she said, snapping a pair of cold, heavy handcuffs onto his wrists. They were tight, much tighter than he expected. "We know about the shell companies in the Caymans. We know everything." As they dragged him out of the warehouse, Mark twisted his head back for one last look at the man who had orchestrated his doom. "You ruined me!" Mark screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I'm Mark Sterling. I'm a visionary." Elias Blackwood simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You're a statistic, son, and not a very interesting one." The ride to the Federal Detention Center in Lower Manhattan was a blur of misery. Mark sat in the back of the SUV, squashed between two silent agents. He thought about the champagne he had drunk last night. He thought about the softness of the sheets in his penthouse. He thought about Jessica's laugh. It all felt like a hallucination now. When they arrived at the detention center, the reality of his new life hit him with the smell industrial cleaner, stale sweat and despair. He was processed like cattle. They took his Italian suit, his silk tie, and his handmade shoes. In exchange, they gave him an orange jumpsuit that scratched his skin and canvas slip-ons that were 2 sizes too small. "Name," the booking officer barked. "Mark Sterling, CIO of Inmate 78402. The officer interrupted, typing it in. "Move along." Mark was shoved into a holding cell, It was a concrete box, 10 by 10, with a metal toilet in the corner and a bench that looked harder than the floor. There was already someone in the cell, a massive man with tattoos climbing up his neck like ivy, sitting on the bench reading a crumpled newspaper. Mark stayed by the bars, gripping them. "Hey, I need my phone call. I know my rights." "Shut up," the man on the bench grumbled. Mark spun around. "Do you know who I am? I can buy this whole prison. I just need to make one call to my lawyer." The man looked up. He squinted at Mark. Then a slow, gap-toothed grin spread across his face. "Wait a minute," the man said, standing up. He was enormous, easily 6'5". "I saw you on the TV in the rec room. You're the champagne guy." Mark straightened his spine, a flicker of hope igniting. Yes, that's me. Mark Sterling. Look, if you can help me get a message out." "Nah, not that." The man laughed, a deep, booming sound. "You're the guy who bragged about stealing his wife's money, the mechanic from Ohio guy." Mark's face drained of color. "Yeah, that's you." The man slapped his knee. "My ex-wife took my truck and my dog man. I hated her. But what you did, that was cold. Even I got standards." The man stepped closer, looming over Mark. "You think you're better than her? You think you're better than us? No." Mark whispered, backing into the cold concrete wall. "No, You look soft without your suit, champagne guy," the man sneered. "Welcome to the bottom. It's a long way down from the penthouse." Mark slid down the wall, pulling his knees to his chest. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the harsh fluorescent lights, the smell, the fear. But all he could see was Sarah's face, not the angry Sarah in the boardroom, but the sweet Sarah he had married 5 years ago, the one who had looked at him with such adoration. "I just want to build a life with you, Mark," she had said. He had held the world in his hands, and he had thrown it away for a model who wouldn't even answer his call, and a pot of money that was now evidence in a federal trial. Mark Sterling, the genius, wept. 3 months later. The Southern District of New York courthouse was a circus. News vans lined the streets for blocks. The headline, "The Billionaire Fraud Sterling's Fall," was plastered on every screen in the city. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick with anticipation. The gallery was packed. Former employees of Sterling Dynamics investors who had lost millions and curious onlookers filled every seat. Mark sat at the defendant's table. The 3 months in federal custody had ravaged him. He had lost 20 pounds. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and grey at the temples. His skin was pasty from a lack of sunlight. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit provided by his public defender. His lawyer, a harried man named Gary Soloway, who had stains on his tie, leaned over. "Okay, Mark, here's the deal," Gary whispered. "The prosecution has a mountain of evidence. The wiretaps are damning. If we go for a plea right now, I might be able to get you 15 years. 15 years, Mark hissed, his eyes wide. "I can't do 15 years, Gary. I'll be 50 when I get out. Fight it. You have to fight it." "With what?" Gary sighed, shuffling his papers. "Your ex-wife gave them everything. She kept journals, Mark. Detailed financial journals of your spending versus the company accounts. It's bulletproof." "Call her to the stand," Mark said, a desperate idea forming in his mind. "Cross-examine her. She's emotional, she's vindictive. If we can prove she set me up, that she entrapped me because of the divorce..." Gary looked at him with pity. "Mark, you don't want to do that." "Do it," Mark commanded. 20 minutes later, the courtroom doors opened and a hush fell over the crowd. The prosecution called Sarah Blackwood to the stand. Sarah walked in. If she had looked like a queen in the boardroom, she looked like a goddess now. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress. She walked with a grace that commanded respect. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the crowd. She walked straight to the witness stand and took the oath. Ms. Blackwood. The prosecutor began. Can you explain your relationship to the defendant? I was his wife for 5 years, Sarah said. Her voice was clear, calm, and devastatingly steady. And during that time, were you aware of his illegal activities? Not at first, Sarah said, looking at the jury. Mark was charming. He was ambitious. I believed in his vision. But about 2 years in, I started noticing discrepancies. He would come home with cash stacks of it that he claimed were bonuses. But the company was reporting losses. Why didn't you leave him then? The prosecutor asked. Sarah turned her head slowly. For the first time, she looked directly at Mark. Her eyes weren't filled with hate. They were filled with something far worse, pity. Because I knew if I left him, then he would just find another way to hide it, Sarah said. He would destroy the company. There were 400 employees at Sterling Dynamics, families, people who relied on those paychecks. If Mark crashed the company, they would lose everything. The courtroom was silent. So I stayed, Sarah continued. I played the role of the quiet, ignorant housewife. I let him think I was stupid. I let him think I didn't know how to read a balance sheet. And while he was out partying, while he was with his mistresses, I was at home copying his hard drives. I was tracing the wire transfers. I was building a safety net for the employees. Mark felt like he couldn't breathe. She hadn't stayed because she loved him. She had stayed to hunt him. You were gathering evidence, the prosecutor clarified. I was waiting for the right moment, Sarah corrected. I tried to give him a chance to stop. Last year on our anniversary, I asked him if the company was in trouble. I gave him an out. I told him we could sell the penthouse downsize and fix things legally. And what did he say? Sarah's expression hardened. He laughed at me. He told me to stick to cooking and that he was a god of industry. A ripple of laughter went through the gallery. Mark shrank into his chair. Ms. Blackwood. Mark's lawyer, Gary, stood up shakily for the cross-examination. Isn't it true that you are the heir to the Blackwood fortune? Isn't it true that you could have bailed out the company at any time? You let him fail on purpose. Sarah looked at Gary. Mr. Soloway, my family's money is not for cleaning up the messes of narcissists. Mark had every opportunity to be an honest man. He chose greed. I didn't make him launder money for the cartel. I didn't make him do fraud, his investors. I just turned on the lights. But you deceived him. Gary pressed, trying to find an angle. You hid your identity. That is fraud. It's not fraud to omit your maiden name in social settings, Sarah said coolly. And frankly, he never asked. In 5 years, Mark never once asked me about my childhood. He never asked about my dreams. He never asked who I really was. He was too busy looking in the mirror. She leaned forward, speaking into the microphone, her voice echoing through the room. Mark didn't marry me. He married an audience. Gary slumped back down. No further questions, Your Honor. As Sarah stepped down from the stand, she walked past the defense table. Mark reached out a hand, his eyes wet with tears. Sarah, he whispered, please, I'm sorry. I really am. Help me. Sarah paused. She looked down at his hand, then up at his face. You're not sorry you did it, Mark, she whispered, low enough that only he could hear. You're sorry you lost. There's a difference. She walked away, the click of her heels, sounding like the ticking of a clock running out of time. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the foreman stood up, Mark couldn't even look at him. We find the defendant, Mark Sterling, guilty on all counts. The gavel banged. It sounded like a gunshot. Mark put his head in his hands. It was over. The game, the charade, the life he had built, it was all dust. But as the bailiff moved to handcuff him again, the courtroom doors opened one last time. Elias Blackwood walked in. He wasn't there to testify. He was just standing in the back, leaning against the wall, watching. He caught Mark's eye and gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a nod of forgiveness. It was a nod of completion. The debt had been paid. The mechanic from Ohio had fixed the problem. Mark was led away to a chorus of booing from the gallery, leaving the world of champagne and penthouses behind forever. 1 year later, the cafeteria at the FCI Otisville Federal Correctional Institution was loud, but it wasn't the kind of loud Mark Sterling used to love. It wasn't the thumping bass of a club or the clinking of champagne glasses. It was the clatter of plastic trays and the low murmur of men trying to survive another day. Mark sat alone. He had aged 10 years in 12 months. The grey at his temples had spread, and the arrogant sneer that used to define his face had been replaced by a permanent look of exhaustion. He was no longer the CEO. He was just the guy who mopped the B-block hallway. On the wall, a small television was bolted inside a protective cage. Usually it played sports reruns, but today, someone had flipped it to the news. Breaking news. The Blackwood Foundation announces a record-breaking initiative. Mark looked up. He couldn't help himself. On the screen, standing at a podium in front of a newly built community center in Ohio, was Sarah. She looked radiant. She wasn't wearing the severe suits of the courtroom anymore, nor the beige cardigans of their marriage. She wore a soft yellow dress that made her look like sunlight personified. Next to her stood Elias Blackwood, wearing a simple polo shirt, looking like a proud father, not a terrifying tycoon. We believe Sarah said into the microphones, her voice tinny through the prison TV speakers, that opportunity shouldn't be defined by where you come from. That's why the Sterling Dynamics campus, which we have rebranded as the Phoenix Center, will now serve as a tuition-free technical college for underprivileged youth. Mark dropped his plastic spoon. She had turned his headquarters, his glass tower, his monument to his own ego, into a charity school. She had erased his legacy completely. We are stripping the corporate excess, Sarah continued, smiling at the crowd. No more penthouses, no more private jets, just real investment in real people. Because, as my father taught me, the most valuable things in life are the ones you build with your own hands, not the ones you steal. The camera panned to Elias, who gave a rare, genuine smile and clapped for his daughter. "Hey, Sterling!" a voice grunted from across the table. Mark flinched. It was Miller, a former stockbroker who was in for insider trading. "That's your ex, right?" Miller asked, chewing on a piece of dry bread. "She looks good. She looks happy." Mark stared at the screen. He tried to summon the anger he used to feel. He tried to hate her for ruining him, but he couldn't find it. The anger had burned out months ago, leaving only a cold, hollow regret. He realized now that Elias was right. Sarah hadn't been boring. She had been peace. She had been the only real thing in his fake world, and he had treated her like an accessory. "Yeah," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "She looks happy." "You ever think," Miller said, pointing his bread at the screen, "that if you just hadn't been such a jerk about the divorce, you'd still be in a penthouse somewhere? Maybe not the penthouse, but somewhere." Mark looked down at his tray of grey mash. "Every day," Mark said. "I think about it every single day." On the screen, a reporter asked Sarah a question. "Ms. Blackwood, do you have any comment on your former husband, Mark Sterling?" Mark held his breath. Sarah paused. She looked directly into the camera lens. For a second, Mark felt like she was looking right through the bars, right into his soul. "I hope he finds who he really is," Sarah said softly. "Because the Mark Sterling I knew didn't exist. He was a ghost in a suit. I hope now that the suit is gone, there's a human being underneath." She turned away from the cameras, took her father's arm and walked off the stage. Mark watched her go until the screen cut to a commercial for car insurance. A tear, hot and stinging, rolled down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly with his rough sleeve. "B block movement," a guard shouted. "Let's go, ladies, back to the cages." Mark stood up. He picked up his tray. He walked in line with the other inmates, his orange jumpsuit shuffling against the floor. He had wanted to be a legend. He had wanted to be a king. But as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, locking him in for the night, Mark Sterling finally understood the lesson he had been too proud to learn. The loudest man in the room is usually the weakest, and the quietest woman. She held all the power, and that is the tragic, satisfied end of Mark Sterling. He had everything he needed, a loving wife and a comfortable life, but his greed for more cost him absolutely everything. It's a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. Never mistake kindness for weakness, and never ever judge a book by its cover, especially if that book is the daughter of Elias Blackwood. What do you guys think? Was Sarah's revenge too harsh? Or did Mark get exactly what he deserved? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of karmic justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. We have a crazy one coming up next week about a cheating billionaire who didn't know his wife owned the bank. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.